Welcome to Creepy Whispers. I'm Jack Thompson, and here we'll explore stories that will send chills down your spine. Get ready to dive into the unknown, where each whisper hides a secret. First story, to this day, I can't explain what happened in that house. It all started when my uncle asked me to look after the place while he and his family went to Europe. At first, I thought it would be a breeze, being alone in a huge house with a giant TV and a full fridge. Little did I know that this break would turn into the most bizarre nightmare of my life. I arrived on a Friday afternoon. My uncle gave me all the instructions, handed me the keys, and took off for the airport with his family. The first few hours were quiet. I played video games and ate junk food. But when night fell, I started to feel a strange vibe. I can't explain it exactly, but it was as if the house had grown larger, emptier. The hallways seemed longer and darker. It was in the middle of the night that things started to get really weird. I suddenly woke up to a noise that seemed to come from downstairs. At first, I thought it was just the wind or the house creaking, but then I heard it again. It was as if someone was dragging something heavy across the living room floor. My heart raced immediately. I lay there, paralyzed, not knowing what to do. After what felt like an eternity, I mustered the courage to get up and take a look. I grabbed my phone to use as a flashlight and crept down the stairs, trying not to make a sound. Each step I took seemed like it would creak and give away my position. When I reached the living room, I saw nothing out of place. I looked around, checking every corner, but everything was normal. The next day, I woke up late and groggy. I wondered if I had dreamed about that strange noise. But then, when I went to the kitchen for coffee, I noticed something that made my skin crawl. There were marks on the wooden floor, as if someone had really dragged something heavy. I stared at it, not understanding. Had I done that without realizing it? Or had something really happened during the night? I spent the rest of the day trying to distract myself, but I couldn't get it out of my head. I turned the TV up loud, cleaned the house, even tried calling some friends to see if anyone wanted to come over. But no one could make it. As the afternoon wore on and the sky grew darker, I began to feel that same strange sensation from the night before. That night, things got even more bizarre. Around p.m., it started snowing heavily. I was sitting on the couch, trying to focus on a movie, when I heard a noise coming from the front door. It sounded like someone knocking, but very softly. At first, I thought it was just the wind, but the sound continued. I went there, heart pounding, and opened the door. There was no one there. I closed the door immediately and locked everything. I paced back and forth, not knowing what to do. It didn't make any sense. Who would knock on the door and then run away in that blizzard? And why did the footprints only go up to the door and back? It was as if the person had simply vanished. I spent the whole night awake, checking the windows and doors every half hour. The next morning, I was a wreck. I had barely slept, and my head wouldn't stop spinning trying to understand what was happening. I decided to take a walk around the block to clear my head, despite the biting cold outside. It was when I was coming back that I saw something that shocked me. A small child, no more than 5 years old, walking alone on the snow-covered sidewalk. I ran to her, asking where she had come from, if she was hurt, where her parents were. The girl just stared at me with wide eyes, saying nothing. I picked her up and took her inside the house to warm up. I tried asking questions again, but she remained silent. I called the police right away and explained the situation. While I waited, I observed the girl. There was something strange about her, as if she wasn't really there. The police arrived about 20 minutes later. I explained everything that had happened, from the strange noises to finding the girl. The officers seemed concerned and started asking a lot of questions. While I was talking to them, one of the officers tried to talk to the child, but she remained silent, as if in a trance. They decided to take the girl to the hospital for some tests and to try to identify who she was. After they left, I had a horrible feeling. The house seemed even more sinister, as if it held some dark secret. I started thinking about all the strange things that had happened since I arrived. The noises, the footprints in the snow, and now this mysterious child. Was there a connection between all of this? And worse, did my uncle know something about it? Why had he asked me to watch the house right now? The days that followed were a blur of anxiety and paranoia. The police came back a few times to ask more questions, but it seemed that no one had any idea who that girl was or where she had come from. They couldn't find any records of missing children that matched her description. It was as if she had appeared out of nowhere. I stayed in the house, but I could barely sleep. Finally, after a week that felt like an eternity, my uncle returned from the trip. When I told him everything that had happened, I expected to see surprise or concern on his face. But what I saw was something different, something I can't explain to this day. It was as if, for a second, I had seen a mixture of fear and guilt. He brushed it off, said I must have imagined things from being alone in a strange house. The case of the mysterious girl eventually cooled down. The police couldn't discover anything, and gradually people forgot about it. But I couldn't get it out of my head. Whenever I passed by my uncle's house, I felt a chill down my spine. I avoided going there or talking to him as much as possible. Our relationship became strange, distant. I tried to act normally, but I couldn't forget that look I saw on his face. A month later, something happened that brought it all back to the surface. A child who had been missing for weeks was found wandering near my uncle's house, exactly like the girl I had found. The news exploded in the local media. This time, the police conducted a deeper investigation. They searched the house, interrogated the neighbors, scrutinized my uncle's life. Second story, last week, I had an experience I still can't fully explain. There was this heavy snowstorm, you know. I was making some deliveries for DoorDash, trying to earn extra cash. It was late at night, barely any cars on the road. I took a rather deserted road, thinking it'd be a shortcut. That's when everything started to go wrong. The car began to skid on the snow. I tried to control it, but it was no use. I ended up sliding off the road and getting stuck in a ditch. I spent a good few minutes trying to calm down and figure out what to do. The car was still running, at least the heater was working. But what if I ran out of gas? I didn't even want to imagine that. I tried calling DoorDash, my parents, anyone, but there was no signal. I started mentally kicking myself for being so stupid to go out on a night like this. Outside, the snow kept falling, and the darkness seemed to swallow everything. Suddenly, I saw some lights approaching on the road. I felt an enormous relief, thinking someone was finally going to help me out of this mess. It was a white van, one of those service vehicles. It stopped right next to my car, and two guys got out. They were wearing yellow jackets, looking like road assistants. I lowered the window a bit to talk to them, but something didn't feel right. The guys had a strange vibe, seeming a bit too rushed. One of them said, "Hey, buddy, need help getting out of there?" I said yes, of course, and started explaining what happened. But before I could finish, the other guy was already trying to open my car door. That's when it hit me. This wasn't road assistance at all. My heart started racing. I quickly locked the doors and yelled that I was going to call the police. The guys looked at each other, and the one who seemed to be the leader said, "Take it easy, partner. We just want to help you. Open the door, and we'll sort this out real quick. but his tone wasn't friendly at all. I started sweating cold, even with all that ice outside. I looked around desperately, searching for any way out, but all I could see was snow and darkness on all sides. The guys started banging on the window, harder and harder. I was in panic, thinking the glass would break at any moment. That's when I saw another pair of headlights approaching. I've never felt such relief in my life. It was a tow truck, one of those big ones, with flashing lights and everything. The two guys from the van looked back, seeming as surprised as I was. Without thinking twice, they ran back to their van and sped off, tires screeching. The tow truck stopped right next to my car, and a man in his 50s got out. He shouted over the noise of the wind, "Everything okay in there, son? I saw your car from afar and came to help." I opened the door, shaking, and told him everything that had happened. The guy was shocked and said it wasn't the first time he'd heard a story like this. The tow truck guy, who introduced himself as Bob, helped me out of the car and checked if I was hurt. While he was preparing the tow truck to pull my car out, he told me that some criminals were taking advantage of the snowstorm to rob stranded motorists. They pose as assistants, but they're really after phones, wallets, sometimes the whole car, he explained. I felt chilled to the bone just thinking about what could have happened if he hadn't shown up. Bob worked quickly. In a few minutes, my car was being pulled out of that snow pile. While we waited for the car to be ready to drive again, Bob offered me some hot coffee from his thermos. Never has coffee tasted so good. He continued telling me about other similar cases he'd seen in recent weeks. It's an organized gang, he said. They know exactly where to lie in wait. I kept thinking about how many people might have fallen for this trap. The worst part is that in a situation like that, you're so desperate for help that you let your guard down. Bob gave me some safety tips and emergency numbers for the area, just in case I needed them again. After about 20 minutes, Bob got my car ready to drive again. He advised me to go straight home and leave the deliveries for another day. I didn't think twice about following his advice. I thanked him profusely, offered him some money for the service, but he refused. "Just promise you'll be more careful, okay?" he said. I got into the car, still shaking, but relieved to be getting out of there. Bob stayed with his tow truck until I started the engine and began to drive, as if he wanted to make sure I was really okay to continue my journey. On the way back home, I couldn't stop thinking about what had happened. The snow was still falling heavily, but now every shadow on the road put me on alert. I kept imagining how many other people could be going through similar situations that same night. I got home almost 2 hours later, exhausted and still scared. I could barely explain to my family what had happened. I took a hot shower, trying to wash away that feeling of cold and fear that seemed to be stuck to me. I lay in bed, but sleep wouldn't come. I kept replaying every detail of that night in my head, thinking about how differently it could have ended if Bob hadn't shown up. The next day, I still felt a bit shaken. I called DoorDash to tell them what had happened, thinking they should know about the risks their drivers were facing. The attendant listened attentively and said they would investigate the case. They promised to contact the local police to alert them about the scheme. I wondered if this would really make any difference, or if it was just talk to calm me down. I decided to post about the experience in some delivery driver groups on social media. I wanted to warn other drivers about the danger. The responses to my post were a mix of shock and solidarity. Several other drivers shared similar stories, some even in the same area. One guy commented that he had gone through something similar a couple of weeks ago, but thought it was an isolated case and didn't report it. I started to realize that the problem was bigger than I had imagined. Some suggested creating a WhatsApp group to share information about dangerous areas and help each other in emergency situations. The idea caught on, and within a few days, we had a group with over 100 drivers from the region. In the days that followed, I became obsessed with understanding more about this criminal scheme. I started researching local news, online forums, anything that could give me more information. I discovered that it wasn't just happening to app delivery drivers. Regular drivers, truckers, anyone who needed to be on the road during snowstorms was becoming a target. A local newspaper even published an article about it, but it seemed the authorities still didn't have many leads on who was responsible. I felt kind of helpless, like I had discovered a huge problem, but didn't know how to help solve it. I went back to making deliveries after a few days, but only during the day and in busier areas. I couldn't face the empty roads at night the same way anymore. Every time I saw a white van or someone stopped on the shoulder, I felt a chill in my stomach. The WhatsApp group we created became a kind of support network. We shared real-time locations during deliveries, warned about suspicious areas, that sort of thing. We even organized convoys on heavier snow days so no one had to drive alone. It was comforting to know there were people willing to help each other, even in a job that's usually so solitary. About 2 weeks after the incident, I received an unexpected call from the local police. They wanted me to come to the station to give a more detailed statement about what had happened. Apparently, my social media post and the report to DoorDash had caught their attention. I was nervous, but also relieved to see that someone was taking the situation seriously. At the station, I spent hours describing everything I remembered: the guy's car, their clothes, the way they talked. The detective who interviewed me said they had received several similar reports in recent weeks and were setting up an operation to catch the gang. I left the police station feeling a bit lighter, as if I had done my part to try to solve the problem. But I still had that strange feeling, like at any moment, turning a corner, I could come face to face with those guys again. I started paying more attention to everything around me during deliveries. Every person passing by, every parked car, everything became a reason for suspicion. I knew it wasn't a healthy way to live, but I couldn't help it. The experience had changed something in me, made me more cautious, maybe even a bit paranoid. The weeks went by, and gradually, life started returning to a certain normality. I continued making deliveries, but always with one eye on the road and the other on the WhatsApp group. We kept exchanging information and looking out for each other. One day, while I was making a delivery, I received a message in the group that chilled me. One of the drivers had gone through a situation similar to mine in the same area. This time, however, the police arrived in time to catch the guys red-handed. I felt a mix of relief and fear. Relief to know that they had finally caught some of these criminals, but fear thinking that they were still out there, operating. That night, I couldn't sleep properly. I kept going over everything in my head, thinking about how things could have been different if the police had arrived that night instead of Bob. I caught myself looking out the window several times, as if expecting to see that white van parked on the street. I knew it was irrational, but I couldn't help it. The next day, I saw an article in the local newspaper about the arrest. Apparently, it was only part of the gang, but it was a start. The article mentioned that reports from the delivery driver community had been crucial to the investigation. I felt a mix of pride and concern. Would the other gang members want revenge? The following days were an emotional roller coaster. On one hand, I felt safer knowing that part of the gang had been caught. On the other, I couldn't stop thinking that there were still people out there, maybe planning something worse. The driver's WhatsApp group was buzzing, with everyone sharing theories and speculations about who the other gang members might be. Some even suggested doing a kind of volunteer patrol in the more dangerous areas, but the idea was quickly discarded as too risky. A week after the arrest, I had a surprise. I was coming back from a delivery when I saw a white van stopped on the shoulder, just like that night. My heart raced immediately. I slowed down, ready to turn around if necessary. But as I got closer, I saw it was just a guy changing a tire. He even waved at me, all friendly. I felt kind of silly afterward, realizing how much I was letting fear take over. That night had affected me more than I wanted to admit. Third story, I'm still trying to process what happened last month during our ice fishing trip. It was an experience that left me completely bewildered and honestly, a bit scared. It all started when my wife, our two kids 10 and 12 years old, and I decided to rent a remote cabin for a more authentic ice fishing experience. We were all excited about spending a few days away from the city hustle, surrounded only by nature and the silence of the snow-covered forest. After hours of driving on increasingly deserted roads, we finally reached our destination in the late afternoon. The scenery was breathtaking. The cabin was right in front of a frozen lake, surrounded by tall snow-covered pine trees. It looked like a scene from a postcard. But as soon as I parked the car, I noticed something that made me uneasy. There were fresh footprints in the snow, leading directly to the cabin. I found it very strange, since the owner had assured me that no one had used the place in the last few weeks. I tried to push this concern out of my mind as we unloaded our luggage, but something inside me was already on alert. We entered the cabin and started to settle in. The kids were euphoric, running from room to room, exploring every nook and cranny. My wife began organizing our things and preparing dinner, while I lit the fireplace to warm up the place. I tried to focus on the tasks and the family's excitement, but those mysterious footprints wouldn't leave my mind. I decided that as soon as it got dark, I'd take a better look outside, just to make sure everything was okay. Night fell quickly, as it often does in these isolated regions. After dinner, when the kids were in bed, I grabbed a flashlight and went out to inspect the cabin's surroundings. The cold was biting and the darkness almost palpable. The beam of my flashlight seemed timid against the immensity of the night. I retraced the path of the footprints I had seen earlier, but the recent snow had partially covered the tracks. I was about to go back inside when I heard a noise coming from the forest. It wasn't a nature sound, it seemed more human. A shiver ran down my spine, and for a moment, I was paralyzed, trying to distinguish if it had been real or a figment of my imagination. I hurried back to the cabin, locking the door behind me. My wife noticed my agitation and asked what had happened. I told her about the footprints and the strange noise, but tried to downplay the situation so as not to alarm her. We decided it was better to stay alert, but there was no reason to panic. After all, we were in a remote area, and unusual sounds were to be expected, right? We tried to distract ourselves by watching a movie on the laptop we had brought, but I couldn't concentrate. My eyes kept drifting to the window, as if at any moment something or someone would appear outside. It was hard to fall asleep that night. I kept imagining 1,000 scenarios, each more frightening than the last. In the middle of the night, I woke up startled by a noise coming from outside our bedroom window. It was a scratching sound, as if someone or something was scraping their nails on the glass. My heart raced. I lay motionless in bed, barely daring to breathe, afraid to make any movement. The sound continued for a few seconds that seemed like an eternity. Then, as suddenly as it started, it stopped. I spent the rest of the night wide awake, eyes fixed on the window, waiting for the sound to return. But everything remained silent. The next morning, I didn't mention the night incident to my family. I didn't want to ruin our trip with my paranoia. The kids were excited to go fishing, so we got ready and left early for the frozen lake. We spent a few hours there, trying to catch some fish through the holes we made in the ice. It was a pleasant moment, almost making me forget about the strange occurrences. Almost. Because while I watched my kids laughing and having fun, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. Every now and then, I looked over my shoulder towards the forest surrounding the lake, but saw nothing beyond the snow-covered trees. When we returned to the cabin in the late afternoon, something caught my attention. There were fresh footprints in the snow, going from the forest to our cabin. My stomach sank. They were the same footprints we had seen the day before, I'm sure. But how? We had been out all day, and there was no one else around. At least, that's what we thought. I quickly entered the cabin, checking if everything was in order. Nothing seemed out of place, but something bothered me. That's when I remembered. We had installed a motion-activated camera on the porch as a precaution. With trembling hands, I took out my phone to check the images captured during our absence. When I opened the camera app on my phone, my heart almost stopped. There were several motion detection notifications. With a mixture of fear and curiosity, I started going through the images. The first ones were just of small animals, a squirrel, a bird landing on the railing. But then I came to a photo that left me cold. It was a shadowy figure, partially obscured, standing right in front of our door. The image was a bit blurry, but you could see it was a person. Or at least, something that looked like a person. I couldn't make out the face, but the posture was strange, as if it was leaning in an unnatural way. At that moment, my wife entered the room and saw me paralyzed looking at the phone. She asked what was going on, and reluctantly, I showed her the images. Her face turned pale. We stood there in silence, trying to process what we were seeing. The kids were in the room, oblivious to all this, and we decided not to tell them. We didn't want to scare them. But what would we do now? We were in the middle of nowhere, with no neighbors nearby, and clearly someone or something was prowling around our cabin. The idea of getting in the car and leaving crossed my mind, but it was already getting dark, and driving on those roads at night seemed even more dangerous. We decided to stay and reinforce our security. We checked all windows and doors, making sure they were well locked. We improvised some homemade alarms using cans and strings at the entrances. Night fell, and the silence that once seemed comforting was now oppressive. Every creak of wood, every gust of wind put us on alert. The children noticed something was wrong, but we tried to disguise it, saying it was just fatigue from fishing. They eventually fell asleep, but my wife and I remained awake, sitting in the living room, watching the windows and listening intently for any suspicious sounds. Around 2 a.m, we heard it. The sound of footsteps in the snow, circling the cabin. They were slow, deliberate steps, as if whoever it was studying us, looking for a way to get in. My wife squeezed my hand so hard it hurt. The footsteps stopped in front of the door. There was a moment of absolute silence, and then we heard 3 firm knocks on the wood. My heart felt like it was going to explode in my chest. We didn't move, we didn't breathe. The knocks repeated, louder this time. Then, just as it started, it stopped. The footsteps moved away, disappearing towards the forest. We stayed there, paralyzed, for what seemed like an eternity, before finally daring to move. The rest of the night was a waking nightmare. We couldn't sleep for a minute, always alert to any sound or movement. When the sun finally rose, we felt momentary relief. In daylight, everything seemed less threatening. I went out to check the surroundings of the cabin and, to my horror, there they were again, fresh footprints in the snow, circling the entire building. They were the same ones we had seen before, there was no doubt. I took photos with my phone, as if I needed to convince myself that I wasn't going crazy. At that moment, we made the decision to leave. It didn't matter how much we had paid for the stay, or how much the kids were enjoying themselves. Our safety was more important. We hurriedly packed our things, making up an excuse about a family emergency for the boys. As we loaded the car, I couldn't help but notice that the mysterious footprints now led from the cabin back to the forest. It was as if whatever it was had finally given up and gone away. Or maybe, I thought with a shudder, it was just giving us a false sense of security. The return trip was tense and silent. My wife and I exchanged worried glances in the rearview mirror, as if expecting to see something following us. The children, sensing the heavy atmosphere, remained quiet most of the time. It wasn't until we got on the highway, hours later, that we started to relax a bit. But the feeling of unease never completely left us. Even today, months later, I still wake up in the middle of the night thinking I've heard footsteps outside our house. I look out the window, expecting to see that shadowy figure. We never told anyone but you what happened on that trip. Who would believe it? Sometimes I even doubt if it was real. But then I remember the photos on my phone, the footprints in the snow, and I know it wasn't a dream. Something strange and inexplicable happened in that remote cabin, and I think I'll never know exactly what.